They told me revenge was a story for men with slow hands and quick guns. They told me it tasted like rust and regrets. I never believed them because I had never needed it before. I had loved. I had trusted. I had folded a life around a name like a prayer. Daniel. When I found out he had been folding other lives around the same name, the world rearranged itself into a map I did not recognize. Revenge did not taste like rust. It tasted like reckoning. My name is Maya Novak. I was 29 when the first truth landed on my kitchen table. A lipstick-stained napkin, Daniel's cologne lingering in the fibers, and a receipt from La Rue, an expensive restaurant 2 blocks from the office he had told me he hated. It was small, almost laughable. The kind of thing you could dismiss as a fluke, a misunderstanding, or my paranoid mind betraying me. The rational part of me did try to do all of those things. But grief is practical. Betrayal is arithmetic. All the little odd numbers I had shrugged off in the past year, the late meetings, the unexplained charges on joint accounts, the phone that was suddenly battery dead at precisely the wrong time, added up to a sum I couldn't ignore. I didn't confront him the night I found the napkin. I walked to the park instead, because I needed space to hear myself. Night folded over the city like a hand, and I let the cold press against my cheeks until the tears stopped wanting to be dramatic. I wanted to scream, to break the glass of his apartment, to set his clothes on fire. I wanted more than anything to throw him into the kind of punishment that existed in the pages of the cheap novels I read in boarding school. But I am not a child, and Daniel was not a caricature. He was a man who brushed his fingers across my knuckles as he left for work and texted me a heart at 3 in the afternoon. He loved me sometimes. He also cheated. Complex things can be true at the same time. That made the ache worse. I watched him for 3 weeks. Not stalked. Not with a camera and a van. I watched with attention. I learned his rhythms, the precise cadence of his excuses, the way his laugh unraveled when he lied. I learned the names of his co-workers, which bars he favored on paydays, the florist he visited when remembering to bring home a bouquet. I kept notes. I turned my life into a ledger of his inconsistencies. This was not about hurting for the sake of hurting. It was learning. Maybe that was the psychologist in me. Always studying patterns, trying to make suffering legible. When the pattern was undeniable, I confronted him. I remember the light in his eyes dim, not into guilt but into calculation. Daniel had always been a man who weighed consequences like scales. He had not expected me to study the ledger. He had not expected me to be anything other than an audience. I didn't mean for it to happen like that, he said, and I could count the syllables of his rehearsed regret. He apologized the way someone apologizes when they are confident the wound will heal quickly. He proposed promises like small, edible lies. No more late nights, more transparency, couples therapy. He wanted to be forgiven. He wanted us to continue. He wanted the easy thing. I wanted more. Revenge, I decided, would not be spectacle. I had no taste for the dramatic set pieces you see in films. The fire, the public humiliation, the revenge that leaves the perpetrator in tatters and everyone watching a morality play. That would have been too similar to what I had been before. The woman who trusted. No. I would design a revenge that unstitched everything Daniel thought anchored him. His control, his narrative of success, his prized composure. I would do it quietly, like water wearing down stone. My first move was to create distance. I told him we needed space but made sure the space didn't look like punishment. It looked like compassion. I moved into a small rented studio uptown and took a job at a private research firm that handled market analysis for luxury brands. It was an ironically apt place to begin. The work required tinkering with perception, crafting desires for objects people believed they needed. I was good at it. Maybe too good. I used my hours to learn how to pull strings without people noticing their threads. Daniel thought he had me back. He would call, hear the faint static of my new life, and say things like, "I can't imagine life without you." He slipped back into the grooves of our old life like a man who had been given a second chance and intended to use it carelessly. That confidence was the perfect starting point. The woman's name was Claire Anders. I found her by following the breadcrumbs that amounted to a career anniversary on social media, and a tagged photo outside his favorite restaurant. She was a graduate student in literature with a laugh that seemed designed to infect pictures. She posted quotes from writers we both knew, the kind of things meant to signal sensitivity. She was young in the way that made her dangerous to him. Malleable, urgent, sure she could fix the past with the right attention. I could have called Claire and told her everything. I could have screamed into the dark and turned the truth into a weapon that would wound them both. But Claire, like me, was a character in Daniel's story. She was peripheral until she wasn't. My revenge was not to attack her. In fact, I wanted her to become an instrument of Daniel's undoing. Unwitting maybe, but precise. I befriended Claire slowly. Social media excuses, coincidental bump-ins at the bookstore, a shared coffee after a panel on contemporary fiction. I became the friend who listened. She told me about her scholarship applications, the paper on unreliable narrators, the way she felt inadequate when she compared herself to peers. I told her things too. Not lies, but curated truths that made my life attractive to someone searching for a model of equilibrium. It was easy. Claire wanted to belong in a story that made sense. I sold her one. Meanwhile, Daniel kept slipping. He started taking pills for stress, he said. He drank more, offered jokes that landed unevenly, and left reviews for restaurants he hadn't eaten in yet. He was the slow disintegration of a man who believed in his own narrative. I sat in coffee shops writing reports about consumer behavior and wrote in my ledger about how men like him perform fidelity without understanding its backbone. I was careful not to be cruel to Claire. I liked her, in an odd protective way. She reminded me of the girl I had been, hopeful, earnest, all the edges not yet worn by disappointment. My plan required her to be human, not a villain. The worst part of revenge is that rarely do you get to choose immaculate monsters to punish. Most often you are left with collateral, which is why I spent weeks making sure Claire would not be irretrievably harmed. If my vengeance had a moral spine, it would be that: punish the person who betrayed, minimize damage to the others. I began by undermining Daniel at work. He was a project manager at a boutique architecture firm, the kind of company that prized image as much as skill. His identity rested on being indispensable. He loved being indispensable. So I attacked his indispensability. I introduced a subtle leak to the firm, not a scandal, but something that made him appear distracted and unreliable. I sent emails from a forged address containing minor scheduling conflicts, quietly altered the metadata on a few documents he handled so they appeared to be out of date, and planted the idea that he was double-booking clients. The firm noticed. Rumors bloomed the way a bruise spreads under skin. The initial touch is small, but discoloration grows with each passing day. Simultaneously, I nurtured Claire's rise. I recommended her for a research assistant position at the Cultural Institute where I occasionally consulted. I used my network to procure meetings for her, praising her work to the right people so her CV would look irresistible. Claire, who had never been particularly lucky, got a call. Her confidence swelled. In my ledger, I recorded each step with clinical satisfaction. Claire's first brief at the Institute, Daniel's missed deadline, a passive-aggressive comment in a company chat. The scales were tipping. Daniel felt the pressure. He took to lying more aggressively, blaming system errors, and demanding loyalty from colleagues who, quietly annoyed, began to keep their distance. The architecture firm had always been a small world, and reputation was currency. I had merely started a quiet bankruptcy. The financial thread I tightened second. Daniel had acquired an investment account under both our names, something we had agreed to as a safety net. He assumed I would never touch it. I moved funds, not in dramatic drains but in careful redirections. I set up automatic transfers that looked like normal withdrawals but siphoned into a portfolio that, by legal design, would be difficult for him to claim without an audit. Call it theft if you must, but by the time he noticed, he would be distracted by other collapses. I did not want to ruin him entirely. I wanted him to fall with dignity intact but empty in places he prized. The hardest part of revenge is that it requires you to become someone else. Patient, procedural, heartless in the specific way of surgeons. I learned to sleep through the tremor of my own anger. I learned to measure satisfaction in outcomes rather than storms. Then I turned the world into a mirror for him. He loved performance. He loved to be the lead in conversations, to command the room. So I crafted situations where his performance would fail not because his talent was lacking but because the stage had been modified. I arranged for his major presentation, the one that would determine whether he received a promotion, to coincide with a leak of a sensitive email, a fabricated message about his mismanagement. The file had been subtly altered to include a footnote that made him appear negligent. That email went viral within the small, tight network of his clients. People whispered. Clients pulled back. Daniel stood at the podium, words rehearsed on his tongue, and watched his credibility drip away like wax. He called me that night, voice thin. "Maya, they're talking about me." "I know," I said. My voice felt distant. There was a part of me that wanted to gloat, to let him know I had been the hand that tipped the scale. But teachers of cruelty warn you against gratuitous triumphs. They say retaliation tastes best when savored silently. I wanted him to sit in a room and count his losses alone. As his professional life shuddered, his personal one unraveled differently. Claire and Daniel grew close in a way that made them dangerous together. Secret notes, earnest texts, the ritual of stolen mornings. But proximity reveals truth. Claire began to notice things about Daniel she had not anticipated. He was inconsistent when she asked simple questions, slippery about the details of his past. She started to keep a private notebook, at first as a way to track her observations for a paper on narrative construction, then as a ledger of her own suspicions. This is where my cruelty required courage. I could have used Claire as a pawn to publicly humiliate Daniel, but instead I told her everything. One night, over tea in a low-lit cafe, I slid my own ledger across the table and said, "I think he's been seeing you." Her face flushed red. Not with anger but with confusion. "Why would you?" "Because I loved him," I said. The words were small. Not a weapon but a fact. "And he betrayed me." She read the pages, the dates, the receipts, the emails I'd traced. Her hand trembled when she reached the part where I had manipulated his work emails. She looked up at me like I had become a stranger. "You did this," she whispered. "I designed consequences," I corrected. She was furious, hurt, and then, quietly, rational. "If this is true, then he deserves it," she said. It was the kind of thing people say when they need to confess their own complicity. But I don't want him miserable. I want him to know what he did. We formed a shaky alliance. Claire was an instrument I could not fully control, and that was the point. I wanted a truth so clear that Daniel could not spin it away. I wanted him to be made accountable. We staged the reveal the way a chorus reveals the secret in a Greek tragedy. With timing, with precision, with an awareness of the audience. The audience, in this case, would be his firm, his friends, and the small constellation of people who had once adored Daniel's narrative. Claire invited him to a reading at the institute where she had been promoted. He came, smug and seductive, expecting a routine evening. I arranged for a projector, a small after-party, a guest list heavy with his colleagues. I made sure every device in the room could access the institute's network. Then Claire read. She read a passage she had written. A short essay about trust and the dangerous ways humans justify small cruelties. The essay was tender and precise. As she read, slides began to appear on the projector. Screenshots, receipts, the napkin photo, the receipts from Leroux, the emails I had forged to show a pattern of deceit. The last slide was a simple sentence: "You deserve to be known." Daniel's face registered shock, then anger, then a slow, deliberate attempt to compose himself. He stood, tried to laugh it off, but laughter is a fragile instrument when the strings have been cut. "You set me up," he said to me afterwards, voice raw. "I set you up to be honest," I replied. There was a dizzying public humiliation that night, yes. But it wasn't the kind I had imagined when the word revenge first lit something hot and red inside me. It was surgical. Measured exposure, the collapse of narrative, the soft fall of a man whose props had been removed. He had to answer to people whose opinions he cared about. He had to reconstruct his life in the bleak light of what he had done. What the event did not account for was his capacity to adapt. Daniel is not a villain in the way movies make villains. He is a man who is clever and self-preserving. He apologized, profusely. He promised changes. He offered charity, therapy, grand gestures of contrition. He wanted to rebuild. Part of me wanted to accept it. After all, people are capable of growth. But trust, once violated, is a structure you cannot rebuild on the same foundation without starting over entirely. I did not want him to grow back into the man who hurt me. I wanted him to learn that his actions had an echo. The last act, the one that felt like the culmination of months spent turning over the soil of his life, was simple and devastating in its normality. I withdrew from him completely. Not with fanfare. Not with a dramatic letter. I simply ceased to be available. I cancelled our shared leases, moved the last of my things, and quit the impulse to message him back. People imagine revenge as booming, cinematic. Mine was silence. Silence has teeth. He reached out in a way he could not with words. He arrived at parties where I wasn't invited and discovered his social reach had narrowed. The firm offered him an ultimatum. Take responsibility publicly and accept oversight, or resign. He chose to resign. His clients found consultants who did not smell faintly of scandal. Claire, hurt and brave, cut ties. Her career progressed. She published an essay on mistrust and the social currencies of betrayal. She dedicated it, obliquely, to lessons learned the hard way. In the end, when the dust settled and the ledger pages no longer trembled with fresh ink, I sat in my small studio and let myself grieve. Revenge does not erase pain. It rearranges it. It creates a space where you can breathe without the weight of someone else's lies. Daniel was not destroyed. He was diminished in the particular places that mattered to him. He had to wake up to a life he had not fully designed for himself, a life where his choices made noise that followed him. That was justice enough. People often ask if I felt triumphant when I saw him stumble. The answer is both yes and no. There was a small, precise joy in watching him count the cost, like someone who had finally collected on a debt. But there was also a hollow, because revenge changes you. It makes you competent at cruelty in ways that can be intoxicating. I am not proud of all I did. There were nights when I lay awake wondering whether I had gone too far, whether I had become the kind of person I had feared. The ledger in my drawer is both evidence and confession. Names, dates, small admirals of success and harm. The victory, because that is the word you asked for, came in the quiet return to myself. It was not seeing Daniel humiliated at a party or fired from his job. It was the moment I sat across from Claire, two women who had been wronged by the same man, and found the courage to be honest in a way that wasn't performative. I told her I was sorry for manipulating her life, and she told me she forgave me, not for me but for herself. We did not become sisters. We did not need to. We became co-authors of a new narrative that did not include him. Months later, Daniel called. It was a brief, awkward conversation where he asked how I was, and I said, well. He asked if we could meet and talk. I imagined the old comfort wrapped around him like a shawl, the way people thread back to familiar warmth even when that warmth burned them. I told him no. His voice on the other end of the line was a lesson. Sometimes people ask for forgiveness because forgiveness is currency they want to spend, not because they have the humility to earn it. I kept my refusal steady. It felt less like a punishment and more like a boundary I had learned the hard way to hold. Time is a strange ally. It does not heal everything, but it sharpens the outlines of who you were before and who you are after. I am not the same girl who found the lipstick-stained napkin and refused to explode. I am older in a measured way and thinner in places where my illusions had resided. I have kept pieces of Daniel in memory the way you keep a photograph of a house you once loved. Sometimes useful for context, often unnecessary. I write now, not for fame, but because stories are how I make sense of pain. I teach workshops on narrative reliability and the ethics of storytelling. People come with their own little betrayals, nothing as dramatic as Daniel's, but messy enough to require a map. If you want the final image, here it is, a late autumn morning, the studio window open to a city that smells of wet pavement and new possibilities. I sat with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, the ledger closed beside me. Across the street a man jogged by, headphones in, oblivious to the small dramas that had once consumed my life. I thought of Daniel, of Claire, of the days of fury and the nights of planning. I felt a kindness toward the woman I had been, and toward the woman I had become. Revenge was not a cliff I hurled him from. It was a series of small, deliberate removals of the props he used to hang his self-worth on. He stumbled, learned, maybe changed. I won not because I destroyed him but because I reclaimed the story of my life. That is the fiercest sort of victory. The one where you take back your own narrative and refuse to allow someone else to write its margins. Sometimes I wake in the night and hear the echo of my own decisions. I think of alternatives, of mercy, of the softer kinds of strength. But I also remember the night I found the napkin and how a different woman, a woman who forgave too easily, who folded her life around another's unfaithfulness, would have stayed. I am grateful to the anger that taught me what I would no longer accept. If you are reading this and wondering whether revenge is a path you should walk, know this. It will teach you things about power you cannot unlearn. It will polish a part of you that is useful and dangerous. It will show you the architecture of people's lives in a way that is both intimate and irreversible. For me, the lesson was the cost of complacency and the value of boundaries. I took those lessons and built myself a new life. Quieter, clearer, and mine. Daniel moved away 2 years later. I heard it through a mutual friend who mentioned, almost apologetically, that he had taken a job across the country and was trying to start over. That was the last time his name had any weight in my chest. I did not wish him ill. I only wished him enough clarity to understand what he had done and enough courage to be different. Claire visited once, with a manuscript she wanted me to read. She had aged like someone who had belonged to a scar and come out alive. We drank tea and talked about unreliable narrators and the ways that people deceive themselves more deftly than they deceive others. When she left, she hugged me, a small human thing that did not absolve either of us, but acknowledged the strange companionship of our shared history. I keep the napkin in a small drawer, folded neatly. It is not a trophy. It is a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how decisive our choices must become when faced with betrayal. I am not proud of everything I did. But I am proud of one thing. I reclaimed my narrative. In the end, that was enough to call it victory. They told me the loud parts of revenge would be the sweetest, the gasp of a room, the ripple of ruined reputations, the public unmasking. They were right about one thing. The world hears the loud parts and forgets the hush that follows. I thought the hush would be relief. Instead, it became a new kind of room I had to learn to live inside. Months slid into a practiced quiet. Daniel moved across the country. Claire's essay got picked up and reprinted with a sidebar about the ethics of exposure. People called me brave at readings and asked how I had found the strength to act. Friends offered sympathetic nods and avoided eye contact when my ledger came up. The architecture firm issued a statement about internal restructuring, and, in the mess of it, lost the man who had once been the center of their orbit. Those were the visible consequences. The headlines and the applause and the shrugs. The invisible ones were worse. At first the nights were the problem. My body, convinced it had a debt to collect, would not stop tallying. I lay awake with the ledger's pages unspooling in my head like film. The napkin, the receipt, the altered emails, Claire's face when she read my notebook. I imagined tiny compulsive edits. What if I had done one thing differently? What if I had told Claire earlier? What if I had been patient enough to forgive? Each what if lodged itself like a burr under my skin. I woke with my palms tight as if gripping a steering wheel I'd never let go of. Therapy was a hesitant truce. I found a woman named Elena who smelled faintly of bergamot and paperbacks. She asked about my childhood and the small cruelties that had taught me to catalog people instead of trusting them. She suggested grounding exercises and a journal that wasn't a ledger. "You're living in lists of proof," she said once, tapping my unfiltered confession. "Try living in moments without evidence. Practice being uncertain and surviving it." I tried. I practiced letting a coffee cool and not writing down the time. I let a friend's compliment pass without annotating it. Most days I was an obedient student of my own recovery. Other days I was a juror in a trial that had no final verdict. Guilt is an odd thing. It is not the opposite of pride but a shape-shifting sibling. Sometimes I felt proud, quiet, stern pride that I had taken my life back and refused to be small. Other times I felt like a vandal with a careful hand. Competent, clinical, and proud, yes, but also aware that competence had a price. I wondered whether my actions had taught anyone anything other than the danger of being loved. Claire published another piece and dedicated a paragraph to the complexities of retaliation, and I read it with the same careful attention I used on receipts. She thanked me for catalyzing truth and then, almost as an aside, wrote about the cost. I felt exposed reading it, as if my ledger had been turned into a mirror and I didn't like the face in it. I began to notice small, otherwise trivial things that set me off. A man leaving early from a meeting, a colleague who delayed an email, a text with a delayed blue tick. I would rehearse betrayals, not because they were imminent but because I had trained myself to look for them. My mind became an animal that expected to be hunted. I found myself performing the old habits of observation for no practical reason. Checking receipts, tracking schedules, archiving conversations. The ledger lived in a drawer but its voice lived in my head. I could not, it seemed, turn off the accounting. There were legal murmurs too. A former client from the Institute, a man who liked tidy narratives as much as I did, reached out after a panel and asked questions about confidentiality. He had heard talk of the projector that night, the images that had slid across the screen like evidence. He asked for documentation. He wanted to ensure that the Institute's network hadn't been compromised. He was not harsh. He was fastidious. He asked whether I had the Institute's permission to display files. I felt the blood drain from my face. That night I reread every line I had ever written about digital footprints and social engineering. I called Elena and said, if they look closely, I could get in real trouble. She listened and then, in that professional way therapists have, reminded me that accountability with the law was different from accountability with conscience. We fix what we can, she said, which sounded small and sensible and not at all like the ledger screaming inside me. I hired a lawyer to advise. A woman named Marta who had a no-nonsense haircut and a slow way of speaking that made you feel both smaller and less alone. Marta said the Institute's policies were murky and that what I'd done lived in a gray zone between ethical sabotage and provable wrongdoing. You built a case against a cheater, she said. Courts care what is provable. Ethics care what is true. Those don't always line up. This gave me a new kind of paranoia. The legal kind. I started to imagine subpoenas arriving with polite, embossed envelopes. I pictured depositions where my calm voice would sound like rehearsed anger. I thought of the ledger becoming evidence against me, every calculated move transmuted into a confession. So I destroyed some notes, not everything of course. I could not erase the things that had become part of me, but I removed the most incriminating edits. The act of deletion felt like a sliver of penance. Even as I tried to contain the external fallout, the internal consequences unraveled more insidiously. The ledger satisfaction changed into a different hunger. The hunger to be right. I found myself testing trust in small ways, giving directions and watching to see if people followed them exactly, noticing whether promises were kept down to the letter. I started to undermine relationships the way I had undermined Daniel's life. Not with forged emails this time, but with tiny omissions and withheld information. It was as if the skill I had honed for survival had become a default setting. Claire noticed. Not the manipulation so much as the way I flinched when someone said a certain phrase, the way I answered a compliment with a deflection. During one of her visits, she came by with a box of galley proofs and an exhausted grin. She watched me make my tea with the sort of careful attention that had once made me valuable to her. She set her manuscript on my kitchen table and said, "You look like someone who is waiting for something to happen." "I am," I told her. "I'm waiting for the ledger to close itself." She looked at me for a long time. "Maya," she said, soft and steady, "victory doesn't undo the work you did to get it. You need to live in the aftermath, not constantly measure it." That evening Claire's words followed me to bed like tiny moths. They kept me awake. I asked Elena whether I would ever feel like I hadn't done too much. Elena frowned and said, "Maybe you already decided that you were willing to pay the price." I did not know whether that was consolation or indictment. There were nights when the past crawled into my dreams and rearranged itself into something new. Daniel's face would appear but as a collage made of receipts and meeting invites. He would speak in the voice of the ledger, reciting dates. Once I dreamt that my hands were fingers typing on a keyboard and the screen was blank. Whatever I wrote became true. I woke with an urgent need to call someone, to confess something I could not quite name. Instead I made coffee and read old emails until my eyes blurred. People started to say that I had been harsh. One of my friends, Tomasz, who had been at university with me and who knew both my temper and my limits, cornered me at a bookshop and said, "What happens if you find yourself on the other side? If someone else writes a ledger about you?" He spoke softly, but the question lodged itself like a shard. I had no good answer. I thought of Daniel's apology calls, of his attempt to be forgiven and the way I had refused. Had I been too absolute? Was there a place where mercy would have taught him better than public humiliation? There were small moments of grace, too. I taught a workshop on narrative ethics and a woman in the back asked, not accusatory but weary, "How do you live when you know you can dismantle someone?" I looked at her and felt the ledger's weight and said, "You learn to prefer to rebuild." It was not a complete answer, but it was honest. The woman nodded and the room felt like a fragile truce. Sometimes, and this was the strangest consequence of all, I wanted to be noticed not as the avenger but as the damaged woman beneath the armor. I wanted someone to say, "You did what you thought you had to," and to mean it without judgment. People offered sympathy but rarely the kind that allowed for complexity. They wanted narratives with clean arcs. Betrayal, justice, recovery. Real life, of course, refuses neat endings. On a rain-slick morning, 1 year later, I found the napkin again. It wasn't the same napkin. Of course it wasn't. This one lay on the desk of the institute where I now did occasional consulting. A scrap of paper with lipstick marks and a coffee ring. Someone had left it as a bookmark in a donor's ledger. A casual oversight. My hands went cold. The napkin skittered across my mind like a small animal trying to find shelter. For a moment I was back under fluorescent light, counting receipts. For a moment I heard the ledger cheer. I picked it up, smoothed it with the reverence of someone who had once used objects to verify reality, and put it down again. I had survived the storm, that was true. But storms leave debris. I realized then that my victory had not been a courthouse verdict but an admission. I had stepped into violence, quiet, bureaucratic, surgical, and emerged intact enough to know that intactness had been bought. I started writing more, not case notes but fiction that braided truth and invention. It felt safer there, a space where I could put my demons on paper and choose their endings. Sometimes I wrote Claire into my scenes, sometimes Daniel. Sometimes I wrote a woman who never left the kitchen and who learned that silence could be both refuge and prison. The ledger is still in the drawer. Sometimes I open it and read like one reads a map of mistakes. I won't be the first to tell you that revenge teaches nothing that humility and patience could not, because sometimes revenge fixes things that patience cannot. But I will tell you this. Revenge also teaches you how to be a certain kind of person, and that teaching does not always align with who you want to be next. If there is an epilogue to this quiet, it's this. The cost of taking back your story is that you become intimately familiar with the machinery of narrative control. That knowledge is useful. It is also dangerous. I now spend part of my time helping others untangle their stories before they decide to take justice into their own hands. I do it because I have seen both sides of the ledger. I can recognize the look in a person's eyes when they are ready to step over a line, and I can argue, perhaps with a kind of weary authority, for alternatives. Some nights the ledger still whispers. Other nights I can forget to catalogue a kindness and let it sit on its own. I have learned, imperfectly, to be uncertain and survive it. The city keeps moving, indifferent to human narratives and their messy consequences. I walk it with a smaller resignation now. The kind that understands that victory is not a place you arrive but a landscape you cross, marked by both ruins and new growth. If this is not the end, then the next chapter will be about learning how to live after power. Not wielding it, not cataloguing it, but letting it fade into the ordinary. The ledger taught me how to measure people. Time is teaching me how to let measures loosen, and how to trust that a life can be whole without always keeping the receipts.